us bread, but give us roses, bread and roses, roses, bread and roses.
Hi everybody, welcome to And Roses. I'm Jordan, and I'm joined today by Alex Press, who is a writer and somewhat soon to be author, who spent years covering the American labor movement, primarily for Jacobin magazine, but with work appearing in publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, The Nation, N+1, and Jewish Currents. She's a member of the News Guild of New York. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
No complaints here. I wanted to start because, Alex, I saw that you announced pretty recently that you are working on a book, which is really exciting. And will this be the first book that you published?
This will be my first book.
Congratulations. Tell me about the book. How did it come about?
Yeah, so I've been, I should have been writing books for the past few years, but I'm so prone to getting pulled into the next story and the next thing that's happening in the world that it's very hard for me to kind of take the time out and commit to a project that takes a couple years. This one is kind of my solution to that commitment issue, which is it's called What We Will: How American Labor Woke Up. It's going to be published with Viking Press, and it draws on stuff we're going to talk about for the next hour, I'm sure, about all of the strikes, particularly of the past year, though really kind of the labor movement in America, going back for a few years and moving forward in the near future. So it sort of takes the, 2023's like 500,000 workers went on strike. There were major strikes that we'll talk about in Hollywood, at the UAW with the auto workers. There was kind of this inflection point. And I've been, as you mentioned, I write about all sorts of work and industries in America and have for several years. And I've been kind of waiting and seeing, is this energy that I feel and that I see, particularly among young workers, is it kind of cohering and adding up to more than the sum of its parts and into something that might last? And I finally got to the point where I saw some real evidence that this is for real. And that's why I'm writing the book.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm really excited to just kind of dive into that overall subject. Before we do, though, I'm curious. I've never gotten a book published. What's it been like for you, kind of going through this process, like in the year 2024? How difficult or easy or weird is it to try to get a book published?
It's definitely a very strange process. To me, the most, and probably for most authors, it's really annoying to have to write a very thorough proposal, which is really what you should do if you want like a serious kind of book project and proposal and advance and contract. And so that took me a really long time, actually, because even though, as is clear, I've been thinking about this topic for years and I have a lot of material, to actually think about how to turn a book into a book instead of a series of articles is a whole different can of worms. And so I'd say the proposal process itself was kind of the hard part. You write a sample chapter on spec, right? You haven't gotten a contract, and yet you're spending all of your free time writing this thing with no guarantee that it's ever going to be published. So that wasn't great, but now I'm happy I did it, even though I can't believe I'm actually saying that, because I'm not staring at a blank document and starting a book, and I've been kind of forced to think about the structure and how every chapter is going to relate to each other. So I unfortunately can confirm that it's worth doing. But the process itself, I have an agent, and she kind of handled all the deal making and business stuff. So I didn't really have to handle any of that, which is good, because it's an interesting world, I would say. It's the people who run these book publishing companies are not the type of people that I usually am writing about and for. And so I think it was a real process to explain to them kind of like, this is what working class people in the United States are feeling and doing and thinking. And you just have to trust me that a lot of people care about it. And so that was an interesting translation issue, but ultimately all ended well. So excited to finally get to it.
Can you, I don't need you to spill all of your secrets, but can you make money off of selling a book in 2024? I feel like I hear that it's just the entire industry is going bankrupt and there's just no money there.
You can, but it's completely kind of arbitrary. There's no meritocracy in book publishing, and most people are writing books for very little money.
Yeah.
And certainly, the people actually working for the publishing houses, like especially the junior staff, they themselves are, they've had a wave of unionization campaigns and they have many complaints. And so it's like any other industry, but certainly whether journalism and media or book publishing are dying more quickly, it'd be hard to say. It's close, but both have real structural problems. It's also the big five kind of monopolize the industry, right? And so they're the ones with the money, and if you can't break down the fortress, then you're kind of out of luck.
For those who might not know, what are the big five?
Yeah, so they're Penguin Random House, Hachette Book Group, HarperCollins, Simon and Schuster, and then Macmillan.
Okay, wow.
There was a big court, like a trial last year in DC about whether a potential purchase of one by the other violated would be a monopoly. The result being, and the argument being, that this would hurt authors because all of a sudden, basically, like, they can pay you whatever they want and there's no competition whatsoever. So advances and contracts are going to be just like worse and worse. And so, that's the state of the industry.
I want to talk a little bit about you and your background, and I'd love to kind of learn some of the story of how you got to this moment in your career where you're working on publishing your first book. Yeah, who is Alex Press? Where is she from?
Yeah, so I was actually born in Manhattan. My parents were New York punks of the CBGB's era, so we were living on Avenue C when I was born. Like many New Yorkers, we were priced out of the city, so I mostly grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and that's where I spent, all of my teen years. Then I went to college in Boston, at Boston University. I very much became an anarchist. I started living in an anarchist collective. I was very involved in the organizing scene, especially around anti-police brutality movement. I graduated, I think, like, this is not an unusual story. I graduated, like, top of my class in 3 years and went right back to working at a coffee shop. I'd worked at a restaurant as a waitress since the day I turned 16. So it didn't matter that I, did really well at school. Of course, I couldn't do any internships because I had to work through college. And so it was useless. I'm back just, being a barista for the professors who used to teach me. And so I was, after a certain point, I would always call them I wanted a sitting down job. Right? I'd always had standing up jobs. And I knew the only way apparently that I could get one was to go to grad school, since I was good at school. So I applied for a PhD program, got in, went to Northeastern University, which was just, a couple miles from the apartment I was living in already. So that was convenient, still in Boston. And of course, as soon as I arrived, I got pulled into helping start a graduate student union. And
how did that happen? Like, what was that? How did they approach you?
I can't remember the exact first conversation. Unsurprisingly, really got moving in the sociology and anthropology departments first, as is often the case, kind of like closet of Marxists that those departments are. I think a few of us were just at the bar, and there were, there have been all these NLRB rulings over the past 15 or so years about whether graduate students are employees or if they're not employees. And there was, I don't have the date in front of me and when the kind of favorable ruling for grad unions came down, but I imagine it was shortly after that there was like this new wave of graduate students organizing, and Harvard grad students were the kind of most ahead of the game as far as the Boston area, and they were organizing with the UAW. I, of course, as like at that point a long time kind of lefty activist in Boston, like knew all of this stuff and all of these people, and so very quickly I think me and a couple friends just were like, what if we did that here? And turns out building a union is just kind of a slippery slope where your whole life, you wake up one day 2 years later and your whole life has been transformed. And that's pretty much what happened. I mean, it was a really fun process. It was very tedious, very hard. But for me, it was really life-changing as far as, at a university, a grad student union, it means that you're walking into like random departments, like computer science was one I was canvassing a lot. So we just walk into the computer science building and go from lab to lab looking for grad students. And when we'd find them, we'd say, hey, do you have a minute to talk? We're building a graduate student union. And then you just have a discussion for, what are issues that if it were up to you, what would you change about this workplace? Like,
Yeah.
what are issues you're having at your lab, or what are issues you're having as a TA? How do you think we can change them? Do you think your
Did you have
advisors,
to did you have to like sneak around? Like, was there, like
A little bit,
clandestine nature to this?
a little bit, but I think not as much as a lot of other workplaces, because if you're a grad student, no one's really paying attention, for you to wander around the various but I would say definitely, I'm sure some of my fellow organizers had some weird run-ins with kind of more close-knit departments. But
Yeah.
at a lot of workplaces, it's really, really clandestine. Like, you can't discuss it on the shop floor, or, there's people always looking out.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I think a lot of academics they're too distracted, and they don't realize what's going on under their own noses. And so they're not as aware of what's happening.
Yeah.
And so,
How did
so
it go?
so exactly. So we ended up. So my part of this story is that as part of this effort, I thought I was being really smart, kind of like a double agent. I decided to write my first article, which I wrote for The Nation. And it was about the adjuncts on our campus who were in a big, very ugly fight with the administration over their winning their first contract. Now, I thought this was great because I was like, this will be my excuse to do one-on-one conversations with kind of the leading organizers among the adjuncts, so we can
Yeah.
build ties, and I can get a sense of what we're going to face when we build our union. And that did all work. I think it was helpful. The article was published, and it was fun to write, and I think it was it was very favorable, of course, for the adjuncts. The problem was that it was a slippery slope, and I started writing as a freelancer more and more. And my joke is that I just realized I was a better writer than I was a union organizer, though I think I'm probably okay at both. But so after 3 years in the PhD program, I left grad school entirely to move down to New York City and work for Jacobin as an editor.
Wow. What was that process like? Was it just sort of like a open position that you applied for, or how do you get a job at Jacobin?
I actually was applying for a job, I won't say where, but another kind of left-wing magazine. And just the hiring process was going really slowly. There were many stages. And I came down to New York to speak because Jacobin has, kind of launch parties for its new issues. And I was in one of the new issues. And so I came down as one of the speakers for the event. And I had mentioned to the one friend I had who had kind of like encouraged me to write pieces for Jacobin, my editor, Micah Utrecht, he's the managing editor of the publication. I had mentioned to him this other process, that I was trying to get this job for, and I think I'd complained about how long it was taking. And he must have passed the word on to Bhaskar, who founded the magazine, because after that event, I remember we were in the kind of mini kitchen area of the venue grabbing a beer, and Bhaskar said something like, "Do you want to work here?" And I said, "What?" And he's like, "Do you want to work for Jacobin?" And I remember saying, "Can we have a meeting?" Because it was like 11 p.m. And I was just like, "Can we have a meeting tomorrow if this is a serious job offer?" And he was like, "Sure, come by the office." And we met, and he offered me an assistant editor job. So that was the process.
Yeah. How did your life change going from being a graduate student to being a full-time writer? You were an editor first, so you weren't necessarily like working a beat, writing, publishing all the time.
No. Yeah. And I'd been freelancing a little bit, and I kept occasionally freelancing. But the job, I was an assistant editor, which really is like a lot of copy editing, a lot of transcribing interviews, a lot of kind of like formatting pieces for the website and proofreading the print issue. So really it was kind of like an apprenticeship and education in media. I mean, my life did change in that this was a whole industry I knew very little about. But in certain kind of important respects, it didn't change in that I was already, I'd been on the far left for many years. And that's really, at Jacobin, that is kind of the key, at least I would say largely the key component as far as who's a good fit, is like, do they get the politics? Are they a serious organizer or activist or like serious kind of thinker on the left, everything else is easier to learn. I think this is how Bhaskar put it to me when he was kind of pitching the job. He was like, you can figure out how to edit. Harder is to get your politics, and you already have that. So that, in that respect, it's a very unusual place to work, in that generally, there's plenty of disagreements between the staff, but like for the most part, we're on the same page. And that certainly wouldn't be the case at certainly any kind of for-profit mainstream publication. And so that was, I think, made it very easy to make that transition, because it was just another group of socialists that I was with all the time.
Cool. And then like during this time, as you're getting your crash course on leftist media and just how it works, were you, well, you mentioned that you were still doing some freelance writing at the time, but did you kind of like have an aspiration to be like out in the field working on your own material as more of a focus, or how did that transition come to be?
I mean, I think I had a weird problem, certainly not one I would complain about. A lot of people would like this problem, but it was that I had never written. As I said, the first article I ever wrote in my entire life was published in The Nation. And I had pitched The Nation's email inbox, the slush pile, and got it published. So I was learning
you just sent them an email and they picked it up.
Yeah, it was like submissions at thenation.com or something.
Wow.
And so I really didn't know how to write, and so I was teaching myself to write. So I think it wasn't like that I had big plans and just kind of was biding my time. I think I really was trying to figure out, like, I needed some time to practice. Yeah. And so I would occasionally freelance when I had the time at various publications, sometimes at Jacobin itself. But I sort of realized as I worked at it that I actually quite like writing myself, and particularly, I like reporting. I think a lot of people on the left don't really report. They do a lot of kind of like hot takes or analysis, which certainly is important, and it's something that there's a reason that happens. It's because like the socialist perspective is so missing and so much kind of understanding of the events of the world that it's a clear contribution people on the left can make. That said, I kind of realized like I so would rather just, if there are things going on, I want to go talk to the people that we're kind of like spouting off about. I'd rather just ask them what they think of what's going on. And that is what I do with my labor reporting. I kind of use the platform I have to make people actually hear what the workers at the center of all of these things think for themselves. And so that was very gratifying, and I found people seemed to like talking to me and opening up to me, and so from there it just kind of snowballed. And so I did start wanting to write more, and I switched to full-time staff writer, I think early in the pandemic, I would say, so maybe 2020 or 2021.
Yeah, and the focus on labor, I mean, obviously that's something that you had a bit of a background in. Was that kind of like a conscious choice to really, pursue, because, making that your beat, or did it kind of just happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously there is the lineage I said of like from grad student organizing into kind of writing about labor. But to me, I guess when I reflect on it, I'm fundamentally more interested in what working class people have to think than rich people. I find rich people are generally pretty boring, and they, because they've kind of, many of them have always had it easy, they haven't actually had to develop interesting thoughts or things to say, or kind of like strong analysis. They've been floating on a sea of money. And so I just way more enjoy, talking to working class people. There's also a political kind of analysis, of course, that I think, working class people are the people who kind of have particular leverage in our economy when it comes to kind of getting any of the policies people on the left want. We're going to need to actually build working class support for that. And unions are kind of this tool in the toolkit that actually has power through strikes, through also, all things we can go into. But so there's a reason to prioritize that. But fundamentally, these are people who often, no one listens to, no one wants to hear from, or they want to hear from them, and they feel like there's no way they could possibly find them. And I'm the person who, I'm thrilled to say, okay, today I talked to an iron worker. Okay, today I talked to a striking screenwriter. Okay, like these people, I think, have fascinating things to say. And so I never get sick of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's just so valuable because, yeah, I mean, that the vast majority of working class people just simply go through their lives feeling like powerless, not heard. Yeah, and then when you do have like mainstream publications doing sort of like man on the street type thing, I think about the whole run of like, oh yeah, we went to this like rural coffee shop to talk to Trump
Right.
voters, and just portraying these people who is like, oh yeah, this ordinary salt of the earth working class guy whose dad owns a car dealership and who like drove here in a $150,000 pickup truck. We want to know his opinion as an ordinary working class person, but to be able to actually like elevate, yeah, the little guy. I mean, it's not just for no reason. It's like you're covering the labor beat, and these are people who are taking steps to reclaim an agency of their own, to organize against the bosses. But it's still, that doesn't guarantee that other people are going to tell their story. And so I think that that's really unique, something that obviously you've like gotten a lot of respect for and been able to do really well.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, the one thing I should say is that there's also like a personal bent to it of, my father especially is, he's kind of one of the most amazing artists I've ever met, a genius intellectual. He's also has a terribly poor-paying working-class job, or a fairly bad poor-paying working-class job. And then similarly, the people who kind of won me to the left in Boston were very poor people. They were working-class people. It wasn't like fellow college students that were lending me books that I wanted to read and that were explaining questions I had about politics and about how the world worked. It was like, my then boyfriend who had dropped out of high school, and it was other friends who were, definitely not the kind of pedigreed Boston activist that you kind of caricature, like a Harvard student or something. And so I really fundamentally believe that, it's a matter of pure luck and arbitrariness of who kind of like comes out on top in the social hierarchy and who doesn't. And it's always felt like I just happened to be able to be the one who gets to write about it because I was the one who was getting to go to college. And so it sort of feels like to kind of like respect that perspective is to then use this to kind of show that there are working class intellectuals and that working class people have plenty to say. And that is, I'd say, the kind of personal part that drives the work.
Well, and taking a step kind of slightly back, it's like you're able to do this work because a publication like Jacobin exists, and because there is some money available for you to be able to like travel or be able to focus on this as a full-time thing. I kind of want to talk a little bit about, just sort of like the leftist news economy. Like how is it that it exists? Like how fragile is it? A lot of people, read the articles and they appreciate them, but they don't really know how it's working behind the scenes. What is that like?
Yeah, so it's definitely fragile. I mean, it's kind of miraculous that Jacobin has now been around for over a decade. It's miraculous when any left-wing publication in the United States lasts, but Jacobin, as anyone who's seen the magazine knows, is like a really high quality, like really well designed, like it's a pretty to look at, and it's very obvious that doesn't come cheap as far as just the materials and the quality of the paper and the quality of the design and the art. And Jacobin is really fundamentally like subscriber based as far as its revenue, so it's not advertisements. There are some kind of small amounts of advertising. I don't know exactly how much we charge for those ads, but it's obviously not that much money. And so, that has been remarkably sustainable, but it's a really thin margin, right? Like, no one at Jacobin is making great money. We can't do all the things that we want to do. As you mentioned, over the past year especially, I've traveled quite a bit to report on strikes around the country. I think that has been invaluable work. I've done it largely when I knew no one else was going to go. And so that would have gone uncovered, basically. Not with the Hollywood strike, but certainly with, like, for example, a strike I covered just outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, these manufacturing workers, when I went to Detroit for, the day that Sean Fain, the new president of the UAW, was sworn in. Though that's the kind of thing that I think it really was worth me going. But it's a fight to get that money. Like, there isn't a lot. And it's, Jacobin, fortunately, pays for those plane tickets, and we figure out a place for me to stay or, whatever. But it's definitely lean and mean, I would say. You have to really want it to work in left media. And there are other models, like In These Times has had, which is kind of a comparable though somewhat smaller publication based in Chicago. It has a long lineage. It's much older than Jacobin, of kind of support from unions, so union members and donations and kind of like that is a huge group to tap, as far as like, these are people who, as we know, union members make better money than non-union, and they pay for the publication because it covers their struggles. It makes sense. And so that is another kind of like key demographic to tap. But, it's tough, is what I would say.
We were talking about earlier about just how much easier it is for right-wing publications to exist, and how much easier it is to be like a right-wing writer.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I often remember was there was some debate many years ago between, I think it was people from Jacobin and people from Reason magazine, which is like a libertarian magazine. And I just couldn't believe how unimpressive the right-wing people were. Like, it wasn't even that, like, I found their ideas bad or wrong. It was just like I said about kind of rich people in general, it just felt like they were completely untested. Like, they didn't know how to think or argue. And it's because, as I said, they're kind of propped up. There's such a slush of money, just like, there's a pile of money slushing around on the right. And people can get prestigious, fellowships and things straight from high school to college to, there's so many foundations and whatnot. Yeah. And it's very different. You don't really have to want it. You can kind of like be a fail son who just like ascends to the heights of the right wing. That doesn't really happen on the left, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and it does seem, though, like outside of just that one particular little bubble, even in like mainstream journalism, it's like it's like not a good time in general to be a writer. What's going on? What are the economic forces driving this trend?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. One is, Facebook, Meta and Google have have just completely transfigured and destroyed the revenue model for a lot of publications. Ad revenue has just plummeted, and publications just cannot seem to find a way into sustainability. There's also these VC companies, VC startup money, that are just like buying publications, and then they shutter them when they realize that actually journalism is not particularly profitable as an endeavor. And so we keep seeing that. We keep seeing places get purchased by whatever random kind of private equity company, and then 2 years later, everyone is fired and the publication shutters.
There have been a few examples of that recently, right? Like Paste Media, they were acquired, and now they're like gathering up everybody. What are some of the others?
I can't remember what that one is. I mean, there's so many examples, I guess. Like, so many digital media outlets, I feel like it's impossible to keep track. Like, The Outline is one I think of. Gawker has like lived and died several times. The first time they died was that lawsuit that was filed that Peter Thiel backed and paid for. But then they rose again, and I don't even know if they're still publishing. There's just, the Bustle Media Group. There are all these things, these like entities that I don't really understand and seem to be run by tech guys. Obviously, Vice, I think, just, Vice completely shut down Vice News, which produced really great work. And there's just a general kind of understanding that, it turns out this isn't profitable. The LA Times right now is laying off. They laid off something like a quarter of their staff, or maybe a fifth or a sixth. And they're owned by a billionaire. But the billionaire is kind of realizing, like, oh my God, this is a money-losing enterprise. And they, of course, try to take it out by cutting labor costs. And I think, I have a friend, I won't say who, a longtime journalist, who said his view is that actually the 20th century was kind of an anomaly as far as having been kind of a sustainable model for news, and actually the norm is going to be that there is no news and free press. And I hope he's wrong, and yet the evidence keeps kind of supporting that. There's a lot of debate around how to make this sustainable. Like, I think public funding and federal funding is probably the only actual option, and yet that in itself is not an option, right? Because we understand how the United States doesn't like to fund news or anything, really. Yeah. And so I don't really know the solution, but certainly it is not a good time to be a writer, any kind of writer, but definitely a journalist too.
And it's interesting too, because it's like outside of the, Peter Thiel having a grudge against Gawker and trying to shut them down, it's like, there's not even, I don't know. I mean, I don't actually know, but it seems like it doesn't even require necessarily like nefariousness, like, these razor sharp outlets and we need to buy them up so we can shut them down. It's just like the logic of capital. It's just like these guys trying to make money off of something that they think is cool, and then just like pumping, like being unable to squeeze the margins that they demand and casting it to the wayside.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I always say now is that every problem with writing is about money. Like any kind of writing that we're talking about, I think that applies. But certainly when you think about like the most annoying stuff you read, it's never really reporting, right? It's always like a hot take. It's always something that someone somewhere was probably told they had 60 minutes to write because they had a quota to meet that day, because they work at a digital outlet that forces them to write like 4 blog posts a day. Like all of the bad writing that we read, I'm sure there would be bad writers even in a perfect utopia, but 90% of the really stupid stuff that you read, it's, the writer didn't necessarily want to write it either. And I think this is something a lot of people just don't realize. And that is because like serious boots on the ground journalism, like long form writing, it takes time. And it takes resources. If you're traveling, if you're speaking to people, every interview I do, I'm generally on the phone for an hour with somebody, even if I end up just like using a one quote or a couple quotes from them. And that is not cheap. And so I would say, everywhere you look, the problem is the money.
Yeah, well, and we haven't even really talked about like AI either, which has become, how do you, do you feel like this is a real, I mean, obviously there have been examples of, I think it was like Sports Illustrated that was caught just like publishing fully AI generated articles. Yeah, how have you been seeing that impacting your industry?
Yeah, I have a funny anecdote about this. So I spent a few weeks in Hollywood during the double strike of SAG-AFTRA and the WGA. And I wrote a couple things from there, but I wrote one kind of like article drawing on the past 2 weeks of my time there. So kind of I forget how long it was, but a long form, well-reported piece. And we published it, and, a lot of people read it. It got a fair amount of attention. And the next day, or maybe even that night, I get a text from one of the actors I interviewed for the piece. And she was like, "Did you see this?" And she sends me a link to, I can't remember the website, but it was like some Indian news outlet. And there, with the author was like a real name, a person's name. There was it would be one thing if it was my exact article, but it was slightly tweaked in every paragraph. And like certain sentences seemed like they'd been actually rewritten, but it was very much my article. All the material was my material. And this woman, the actress, had only been alerted to it because she had a Google alert on for her name. And so her name popped up as her having done an interview with this Indian reporter, and she clicked on it and she's like, "Wait, that's what I said to Alex." And so of course that strike itself was about the dangers that AI poses to writers and to actors. And that was much of what the article was about. I think the headline was "Hollywood is on strike against high-tech exploitation." And so to have that article itself be immediately plagiarized and stolen by some sort of AI bot-like entity, I found incredibly funny, and kind of like all that needs to be said about this.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So it's a threat, but there's many threats, as we've now laid out.
Yeah, well, and as we saw with the Hollywood strikes, it's when the threat is present, one of the things that workers can do to resist it is to organize. So I want to kind of switch to just start to talk about your beat a little bit and kind of what's going on in the labor movement in America. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe an interesting place to start is that there was quite a bit of buzz last summer, and I think even the year before. But I just saw a lot of people talking on Twitter about the strike wave, and it's historic. And now for the last several months since October, it's like I feel like the only thing anyone's really been able to think or talk about or try to process is everything that's going on in Gaza. While that has been unfolding, how has the labor movement continued to follow that same sort of upward trajectory?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I say to kind of contextualize this. Just over 500,000 workers struck in the United States last year, which is way up from previous years. But it's important to contextualize here. That is like minuscule compared to how many people used to strike in this country. After World War II, 1 in 10 workers participated in a strike. We're talking about 4 million people, 5 million people, and it was a much smaller workforce back then too. So it's all, I always said, the word unprecedented is not accurate. Historic may be accurate. Certainly, I would say the thing I say is that this is kind of the most kind of revitalized and energetic and lively and happening labor movement of my lifetime, for sure. Because things all, got very quiet starting in the late 70s. And this is the first time that organized labor and working class people, both in unions and outside of them, have really shown this kind of like this feeling that it's a movement. Actually, the way they're acting is not just kind of this like narrow unionism, like only concerned with their own contracts or their own workplaces. There's this kind of growing interaction between different types of workers. And part of the story of that is about the Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020, which kind of introduced the language of class politics to like the younger generations who didn't know anything about unions, right? Most people are, our age and younger have never been in a union in this country. And the understanding of politics and democracy is that it's what happens at the voting booth every 4 years. It's not like this idea of, you can actually build democracy and change your own living and working conditions starting in your workplace, like with your coworkers. And, the example I give of this is the UAW strike. So the auto workers went on strike last fall. About 150,000 of them are covered by these contracts at Ford, GM, and Stellantis. And in the course of a just over 6-week strike, a lot of them doubled their pay. Their contracts they won, some of them, their pay more than doubled immediately. And you think about how the minimum wage in this country has not budged from $7.25 in forever. I can't remember when that was the last change. And yet here's a way that you and your coworkers can actually double your income immediately. And you can get pensions, or you can get better health care, or you can get, full-time work and safer working conditions. And I think a lot of people are really realizing that, and they're starting to turn to unions as kind of the most reliable way to change the country and to change the world. And that's backed up in studies as far as how to reduce inequality, how to, unions make people like have also many more progressive opinions. They, union workers are less racist. There are ways to, end discrimination in the workplace. All these things that I think people are kind of now realizing they can actually implement in their own lives, and they can actually even try to build new unions themselves. And so that is what's going on. There's a million obstacles. Like, it is extremely hard, particularly to form a new union. So we saw a huge uptick in strikes. We did not see an increase in union density, which is, the proportion of the U.S. workforce that's unionized. It is now at 10%, which is like people a few decades ago would never have believed it could get that low. And so it's really, it's this interesting kind of like blockage that the movement is I think, still grappling with. How do we transform all this energy, all this support? The majority of the American workforce says that that they want a union, even if they don't have it, that if they were asked to join a union, they would. And yet they aren't asked, and they can't join one. And so there's some serious stumbling blocks that still, in large part because of kind of the narrow, restrictive nature of American labor law, that have yet to be solved. And so that's the puzzle the movement's facing right now. But I would say that even over the past 6 months, and of course, we don't have to discuss it because I'm sure it would go on forever, but a lot of people in American labor are also organizing around their union support for Israel and the American state's support for Israel. But even, beyond that, there has still been this kind of effort to push things forward. Starbucks workers won a major victory. The company has agreed that they're going to bargain a contract by the end of the year. And so there are developments. The UAW is in the midst of the most ambitious union organizing campaign in decades. They're trying to organize over 150,000 non-union auto workers, particularly in the South, which is like an anti-union stronghold fortress of low-wage labor. And so there's all this stuff going on that is still going on. And thank God, because it needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I guess it's so interesting, just that gap between, interest and desire in joining a union, but, the actual state we're in where far fewer people are involved. What are like some of the obstacles? What are things that can be done to close that gap?
Yeah. I wish I had all the answers, because then we'd be doing it. So there's the obstacles are, one, I mentioned labor law. So think about like you and your coworkers decide you're fed up, you're having a bunch of issues. And when you try individually to get your boss to take them seriously, he doesn't. Or maybe someone even got fired for speaking up too much and being seen as a troublemaker. And you guys realize, okay, you know what? We actually do have to unionize. When you start that process, and it starts by, I always tell people, first thing you want to do is go get a drink with your coworker after work or get a slice of pizza or something and ask them, as I said I did of fellow grad students, like, what are the issues at this workplace? Like, what really needs to change? And hear them out. And everyone, if they, as long as they're comfortable with you, they will have things to say. And, you start talking about, like, the thing we all say in the labor movement is unions are just the word we use for when coworkers are organizing together. So say you get some people on board and you actually have, you're like starting a union campaign. Say you even get a union involved in an existing union to help give you legal advice and, to buy your pizza for you and to help you print stuff. There's all these steps that every step of the way, the boss has the upper hand. So first of all, say the boss gets wind of this organizing and he comes up with a way to fire you. He doesn't say it's for union organizing because that's illegal. He just says, like, oh, well, you were 5 minutes late for your shift and, I'm sick of this. Let's get rid of you or whatever. Mm-hmm. Sure, you can file a claim with the National Labor Relations Board, which is the agency that oversees kind of collective organizing in this country.
Yeah.
It'll take them months and months to get a ruling. Your boss will appeal and appeal. And even if he's found to have violated your rights, the only penalty he's going to get is that he would think this would be good, that he has to reinstate you with back pay unless you went and got a different job because you were actually out of work for a year. Then He gets to subtract all of the money you made at the other job, and then if there's any left over, he has to pay that. But if you got a job that paid the same, then he owes you nothing, right? And you meanwhile, were fired and had to go find a new job and work it for a year. So that's just one example. Unions have no right to access the workers at the workplace, whereas the boss can call you into a mandatory captive audience meeting, a meeting where on shift he tells you, like, unions are lying to you, they're going to make you strike, they're actually corrupt, I'm your friend, you are just subjected to this interrogation that even if it isn't explicitly threatening, I think the message is always very clear, which is that the guy who signs your paycheck does not want you to unionize. He wants you to vote no. And so it's all of these things at every step, right? And it's just, I always say, like, it's a miracle anyone unionizes. And that is just, one kind of like at the level of organizing a union, like some of the obstacles. And so when you think about it at that really like concrete level, you're like, oh yeah, right. There's and bosses they're always firing workers illegally because, as I said, the consequences are next to nothing compared to how much they gain by maybe defeating a union effort, stopping it in its tracks and scaring people going forward.
Yeah.
Those are obstacles. I don't have the answers. I mean, there are reforms on the table that have been stymied forever. The PRO Act is the one that we talk about a lot, which is like a comprehensive set of labor law reform that would do things like increase the penalties for these violations. The NLRB currently is about as pro-labor as it's been in like 80 years. And they're starting to say that if the boss, if there's a violation of a worker's rights, that's particularly bad in the lead up to a union election, they don't have to have an election. The workers just automatically get to start bargaining with the boss. He has to automatically recognize the union. There's all kinds of other things that are too in the weeds to get into. But the problem is that they still aren't happening. And it's kind of a chicken and the egg argument of like, how are workers just going to force this? And when workers kind of force things, when they just start striking or they start kind of like organizing on their own outside the bounds of the law and just with like a kind of fuck it attitude, usually the law will follow and politicians will like start implementing these reforms. But you have to get stronger first. And we've seen a little bit of that at the local level because of this uptick in strikes. We've seen some minor reforms follow from it, but we definitely need a lot more.
Well, the PRO Act is such an interesting one because that was obviously something that Biden campaigned on and sort of had sketched out, these goals, which were, had they all been implemented, would have been genuinely good. And this was something he tried to begin moving like in his first several months in office. And there were several like Democratic senators in the way, even though the Democrats had a majority at the time, some Democratic senators that stood in the way, like, very famously Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. DSA did a huge campaign to pass the PRO Act and actually was able to like flip a few of these senators, but it ultimately they were not able to like move this piece of legislation. I mean, thinking about it in the context of like a presidential election year, is there any hope to think that like, yeah, if Joe Biden is reelected, like that we could see some of this like passing down the line, or is that movement just, dead in the water for now?
I mean, I think it's possible, but like the main thing I think is that like workers just need to organize regardless and act as if they're not going to get these things, right? And so there's also a threat if Trump wins, especially if Trump wins, but certainly possibly even without that the NLRA, the founding kind of labor law in this country that grants workers the right to collectively bargain in the private sector, is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court. Several employers are now kind of like raising appeals toward that end. Those employers include Elon Musk, Trader Joe's, Amazon. I can't remember if Starbucks was one of them. Actually, yeah, Starbucks is one of them, and I haven't gotten a clear answer on whether they're dropping that now. And so there's an attack on, there's a possibility that things are going to get a lot kind of worse. That said, at a certain point when you have, you're back in the Wild West, which is where the movement started, where there was no law governing any of this, and workers just did what they felt they needed to do. They, shut down their plants and factories until the boss kind of caved and they forced his hand. And you're going to see possibly more of that kind of more explosive energy because it's not going to be governed by kind of the existing regime of labor law. I think, again, regardless of what happens as far as at the presidential level, like if workers keep striking when they feel they need to, keep kind of demanding a new union where they feel they need one and don't have one, if these organizing efforts spread, whether it's at Amazon or in the food service sector, like at Starbucks, industries that are almost entirely non-union, if people continue to start launching new union campaigns, people will feel forced to support them, right? Because it has so much public support. And workers just need to do what they need to do. And so that's why I always say is like, don't wait on any elected official because they always will let you down in this country. Just take what you need. And if you all act together, then they can't fire all of you, is kind of how I say it. There's no illegal strike. There's just an unsuccessful one, is another saying in the American labor movement.
Yeah. Well, in the context of working on this show, I wanted to talk about like intersections of creativity and social change. And one of the things that I had observed is in the last several years, at least I've seen so many more examples of unionization efforts, strike efforts being led by, younger, more creative people, not the like blue collar factory workers that you necessarily think of when if you're, I guess like an 80-year-old thinking about like who's a union member. I mean, I'm thinking of, like you see museum workers organizing, Starbucks workers in games, REI. And I guess, we were talking about this earlier, is that I kind of wanted to have this conversation about like, what is it that's kind of unique about, these young creative people who are getting involved in this. But you were sort of saying that's not really the right question, because it's not actually just unique to these young creative people. They're simply part of a larger trend that is kind of falling along class lines, which is like working class people who are fed up of being given the short end of the stick are figuring out what are the options that are left to them if bargaining individually in good faith with the boss has been proven to not be an option. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's right. I mean, because these are people who I think a lot of people traditionally don't think of as working class, and it's an oversimplification to say that their industries have, like, the bottoms have fallen out and they've been, the term we use, on the Marxist left, proletarianized, right? These are workers who might have college degrees, but suddenly they're working at REI and they're working at Starbucks, and maybe they're creative people, but all of a sudden their creative labor is getting paid at, they're temp contract workers and it's gig work, and, there are all these things that all of a sudden they're realizing like, oh, just like any other workers 80 years ago realized that they needed to organize if they ever want to better their working conditions. These workers too are now realizing, my friend, a labor historian, Gabriel Winant, he often uses the example of mine workers, right? Because that is, you mentioned the caricatures of like the blue collar worker. often you'll hear from in white collar workplaces, the boss will say, look, like unions are good for mine workers, or factory workers, but not for you. And Gabe always pulls out this great quote from the time, because of course mine workers weren't originally unionized. And the bosses would always say back then, well, the mine worker actually has particular autonomy over the schedule of his routine in the mines. And he's a particularly kind of autonomous and like skilled worker and has all these things. Unions aren't for you. And so this is in fact just a repeating story again and again. And actually the fundamental difference is, do you work for a wage or do you not? And so I would say, yeah, that we've seen kind of an uptick in these particular types of people, I'd say, rather than types of workers, like these particularly urban, downwardly mobile, millennial, kind of the college student who's deeply indebted and now working at Starbucks is kind of the caricature. And certainly that's real. And that's also true, out in Hollywood, where a bunch of writers are realizing that they are not going to make the kind of money that they kind of read about in memoirs from writers in the 1950s. That suddenly being a writer in Hollywood does not guarantee, I spoke to one actor in Hollywood who was out on the strike line and had been in a million shows, and she couldn't pay to fix her car that she needed to get to work. And she's like, and I've been an actor for over a decade. Talk about you can't even own a home. I can't even get to work anymore. And so there's definitely been that. And then the other thing I say though, is there's two more things. One is that, to emphasize the kind of similarities, is that there also has been incredible kind of energy among these blue collar workers too. I mentioned going to a strike in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is the workers are precisely the caricature you're talking about. It is a Rust Belt, blue collar, almost entirely white area. And these workers, they didn't just go on strike, they actually went on strike for environmental issues. And so things are actually much more complicated on the ground in the working class than I think a lot of people see from the outside. And it's part of why I love what I do, is I get to see it and show people how complicated it is. The last thing I'll say, just because it happened recently, the REI workers have unionized a few stores. So not a ton of the many REI locations, but in Soho, based in New York, the Soho REI was, I think, the first to organize. And a few weekends ago, I went to a play that was written by and starring and performed by members of the REI Soho union store. Because because someone who works at that store is a playwright, and two people who work there are actors. Everyone else was an amateur, and they did great. It was very fun to watch. But that is what creative labor is now. You aren't a creative person and thus you don't work at a retail outlet. No, often you're doing both. And I think a lot of people forget that, but certainly in a city with rent as high as New York City, very few people are making a full living off creative work. And so I think we constantly have to kind of complicate our understandings of these different categories of people and of work, and realize that often they're one and the same people.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to kind of start wrapping this up a little bit. Obviously, I think organizing is the solution for just about anybody. But for people who, are listening to you as somebody who is a working leftist writer and think to themselves I would love to do something like that. What advice would you have for somebody who thinks is it possible for me to have a career doing this?
I get asked this question a lot, unsurprisingly, and I'm always very upfront about, my joke now is that you could actually fit the number of full-time staff writer labor reporters at a not just at a dinner table, but you probably wouldn't even need to make a reservation. It is single digits in this country, seriously, which is crazy. And so all of which to say, it is very, very hard. Places do not value this work. Which it only makes it more important, in my opinion, of course. And it's not to say that, people don't read it. I'm very proud of the very diverse working class readership I've developed who are very loyal, who, stick with me and learn about each other through my work. That's, an honor. Honestly, it's the thing I'm proudest of. And so if you feel so moved, the thing I say is just start writing. Just get the practice. I joked about having to practice in a weird way, at a national publication. Don't do that. Just already have learned to write, of course. And so whether you start as a blog or you think to yourself, is there a particular community or subject or niche that I already like say I have good sources on, or say you've read a ton about some subject, say it's historical, some labor union you're interested in, or kind of the development of particular technology in an industry. Just like you can pitch places, just, find the editor's email and try to write it. I really, I always say I don't know what journalism school teaches. It seems to be a big scam that takes your money. Don't do that. Its actual purpose, when I'm not being facetious, is like so that you can meet other rich people. But you don't want to do that. You want to be a labor reporter. You want to go the opposite direction of journalism school. And so that's what I would say, is just start doing it and trust that, like, just by dint of, if you're out in the milieu of working class people, if you're a part of the left community, if you're out at picket lines and you're out at fundraisers for, the Teamsters and DSA, you will quickly develop more knowledge and better sourcing than anybody else. That's certainly how I do it. These are just the people I'm around all the time. And so that's how I know so much about what they're up to. And so just live in that world and you'll find yourself really having something special that even these people who don't value this work at all will realize that, oh, okay, you actually do have something to contribute. And that's how you start writing. I mean, that's my only advice that I can give. And the other thing I would say is that I'm happy, maybe if you want to link this or something in the description, there's an organization called the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, EWOC is what it's called, and it's a joint project of DSA and the United Electrical Workers, who are like the most left-wing union in America. They just put out a little, like, I wouldn't quite call it a book. It's a little shorter than that, but it's more than a pamphlet. It's called Unite and Win. And it's meant to be a resource for, like, someone who is thinking, like, okay, I'm interested in a union and I have no idea how to organize one. And so I'm like, oh, thank God, because I get asked this question all the time too. And now I can just send people, if you want to put the link, Haymarket Books published it. It is I read through it. It's very helpful as far as answering all of those questions for you in a very accessible but also very detailed way. So that would be another thing I would say for a different type of advice.
Yeah, I'll absolutely link that. Also featuring illustrations by friend of the show, Paul Zappia, and Down the Street Designs. But Alex, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's fun.
Have a great day, and thanks for listening to And Roses.